The sun dipped low behind the trees as the Roberts family finally unloaded the last of their belongings into their new home, Hillmore House. It was an old Victorian mansion with creaky floors, grand staircases, and more rooms than they could count. Sarah, a bright-eyed 12-year-old, and her younger brother Peter, who was just 5, were thrilled to explore the vast expanse of their new home. "This is it, Sarah. You finally get the private room you've always wanted," said Mrs. Roberts with a smile as she watched her daughter rush upstairs. Sarah had dreamed of having her own room for as long as she could remember. The room at the end of the hall on the second floor was perfect. It had a large window overlooking the sprawling backyard, a cozy nook for reading, and just enough space to display her collection of books and trinkets. It felt like a little sanctuary away from the world. The family celebrated the move with a pizza dinner in the living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. They laughed, talked about their plans for the house, and went to bed with a sense of excitement for the new life they were about to start. The clock in the hallway struck midnight as Sarah lay in her new bed, her eyes fluttering closed. The day had been long and exhausting, and she welcomed the comfort of sleep. Just as she was drifting off, a faint creaking sound pulled her back to wakefulness. She lay still, listening, her heart beginning to beat faster. The sound came again, louder this time. A creak, followed by a soft, deliberate thud, like footsteps. Sarah sat up, her ears straining to catch any more sounds. The house was old, and she knew it could be noisy, but these sounds didn't seem like the usual groans of an old building. They were too deliberate. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of the attic door opening. It was right above her room, the hinges squealing in protest. The footsteps resumed, soft but unmistakable, moving slowly across the floor above. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide with fear. Who was up there? Her parents were in the master bedroom down the hall, and Peter was in his nursery next door. She was certain they were all asleep. Sarah lay frozen in her bed, listening to the sounds above. The footsteps seemed to stop directly over her head, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated, and the attic door creaked shut. She stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything else, but the house had returned to its eerie silence. When morning finally came, she was bleary-eyed and exhausted. At breakfast, she tentatively asked her parents if either of them had gone into the attic the previous night. "No," her father replied, looking puzzled. "Why do you ask?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "No reason," she lied. She didn't want to worry them, especially on the first day in their new home, but the unease gnawed at her, making her wonder if they were really alone in the house. The day passed without incident, and Sarah tried to shake off the memory of the night before. She spent the day unpacking her things and helping her mother arrange the house. Peter was content playing with his toys in the nursery, and for a while everything seemed normal. In the afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Roberts had to leave on a short business trip. It was an unexpected errand, but they promised to be back by evening. Sarah was left in charge of looking after Peter, something she was used to and usually enjoyed. As soon as their parents left, Sarah and Peter began playing a game in his nursery. They laughed and chased each other around the room, forgetting all about the strange noises from the previous night. But then Sarah went to the toilet for a minute, and when she came out, she heard her little brother crying, and she ran to him. When she ran out into the corridor, she saw that the attic was open for some reason, and her brother was lying next to her and crying loudly. She ran up to him and tried to calm him down, and then she looked up. As she peered up into the darkness, her blood ran cold. A figure was standing at the top of the attic stairs, barely visible in the shadows. It was a man, his skin pale and sickly, his eyes as black as coal. He was staring directly at Sarah. A horrifying smile stretched across his face. For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. The man's gaze seemed to pin her to the spot, his smile widening as he watched her. Then suddenly, she found the strength to move. Clutching Peter tightly, she turned and bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran into the living room, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She collapsed onto the floor, holding Peter close as he sobbed into her shoulder. They sat there, huddled together, waiting for the terrifying man to come after them. But the house was silent, save for the sound of their own breathing. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah and Peter waited, too terrified to move. Just as Sarah began to consider making a run for the front door, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She peeked through the curtains and saw her parents getting out of the car. Relief washed over her like a wave. She unlocked the door and rushed out to meet them, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, Dad," she cried, grabbing onto her father's arm. "What's wrong, Sarah?" her mother asked, concern etched on her face. There's a man in the attic," Sarah managed to say between sobs. "He was watching us. He smiled at me." Mr. Roberts frowned and immediately pulled out his phone to call 911. "Stay with your mother and Peter," he instructed Sarah, his voice firm. "The police will be here soon." The police arrived within minutes. They were calm and professional, but Sarah could see the tension in their eyes as they entered the house. The officers headed straight for the attic, flashlights in hand, while another officer stayed with the family. Sarah clung to her mother, her eyes never leaving the attic door as the officers disappeared inside. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then suddenly, they heard the sound of footsteps coming down the attic stairs. The officers emerged, and between them was the man Sarah had seen. He was disheveled and gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely off his frame. But what sent chills down Sarah's spine was that same smile on his face, twisted and unsettling. His black eyes were locked onto hers, and he didn't look away, even as the officers led him out of the house in handcuffs. Sarah hid behind her father, unable to bear the sight of that terrifying smile. The man was muttering something under his breath, but Sarah couldn't make out the words. She didn't want to. One of the officers approached the family. "We've taken him into custody," he said, his voice steady. "It appears this man has been living in the attic for quite some time. We found evidence of food and other items he's taken from the house." Mrs. Roberts gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. How long has he been here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're not sure yet," the officer replied. "But it seems like he's been here for months, possibly even before the house was put on the market. The previous owners might have left because of him." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what the officer was saying. The strange noises, the footsteps, the missing food. It all made sense now. But the thought that this man had been living above them, watching them, made her feel sick. "We'll need to conduct a thorough search of the house," the officer continued. "But it looks like you're safe now. He won't be coming back." The rest of the day was a blur for Sarah. The police stayed for hours, searching the entire house and questioning her parents. Sarah couldn't bring herself to talk to them. She was too shaken by what had happened, and the image of the man's smile was burned into her mind. Eventually the police left, assuring the family that they had secured the house and that it was safe. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over her. That night, her parents insisted she sleep in their room. They tried to comfort her, telling her that everything was okay now, that the man was gone, but Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, his cold black eyes staring at her from the darkness. For weeks, Sarah was too afraid to sleep in her own room. She kept imagining that the man was still in the house, hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come out.